Okay, this is the vocabulary lecture for Lesson 5. Lesson 5 begins Section 2 on the principles of composition, which you can see up here. And, you know, as I said, this book is divided into 4 sections. So composition is the way that we put together all of the elements in the picture plane. And the picture plane is what makes all of the elements together work in a harmonious way. So a lot of the vocabulary that we're starting with over here starts to deal with some of the tools that you can use to build a harmonious composition or a good balanced composition. So I'm going to move this out of the way. We're going to start out with the word cropping. And what I did here was, first I did a contour drawing of a paper punch. Now this is the paper punch here. Now basically, what I did is I traced this one, but as I'll talk about in the next second part of this lecture, when you have to do contour drawing of objects, we'll talk about this more in detail. But I wanted to use this one object here just to illustrate a couple points. Now you see right here where I say floating in the picture plane. The picture plane doesn't exist until I draw a border. So if I draw a border on here, now I have a picture plane and I have my object is floating inside of it. Now we talked about this before. It's not touching the edges of the picture plane, and so the background or the negative space is all around it. So this is not a very strong visual statement when you're trying to do a composition. So that leads up to our another word. We have a couple words here. One of them that we've already talked about, and I traced the same object 2 or 3 times. Now we talked about closure last time. And you see right here, it's achieved by touching the opposite sides of the picture plane. So if I simply, instead of making this bigger, I simply make the picture plane touch this, which is just a reverse engineering here, way for me to do this, to show you quickly what I'm trying to get across. Okay, now you have what you know is closure, and you have the object touching the opposite ends of the picture plane. You've now divided it into 2 negative shapes or background or ground shapes, but now in this case, because this one was split, you have 3 ground or negative shapes. 1, 2, 3. Now, I want to talk about a couple other terms while we're talking about this particular image. And you notice that one of the terms we have is focal point. Now, focal point and emphasis seem in the back of the glossary, if you're following along, that they are similar terms, but they aren't. In this case, focal point means the center of attention or visual attention in the picture plane. In this case, without these numbers, and I'm going to go back to using my gum eraser. And again, I've talked about this gum eraser before, and I said, you know, makes a lot of crumbs. So we use that one. And then I've got my kneaded eraser, which doesn't look like yours because mine's got about 5 of them put together, and they're pretty dirty because, you know, this stuff absorbs the media, and after a while, as I said earlier, this stuff gets hard and dark, but it doesn't create the crumbs and it still works. Okay, so now back to this. If you look at this as a simple image, the most complicated part of this is what draws your attention. The most complicated part is all these small linear elements over here close together, so that the focal point of the picture plane at this point in time, at the way it looks now, is in this area up here, just because of the close proximity of different types of lines. Okay, now, emphasis can result in something else. It can be an area that has more emphasis than another because of what you did to it. Now, if I was to take this and I'm, doing a value shading in the background or in the ground or the negative shape of this area in here. Okay, now this has more emphasis than this because of the value that I put in it. Now if I asked you, does it have a focal point? And you'd say, well, I don't know, maybe. Looks like this attracts more attention than this, but this has a lot more detail than this. So in this case now what you have is the attention is kind of divided, so it has a poor solution for a focal point. But it does have emphasis in two areas. That's the difference. Now I have a third one. You might notice this word down here, visual weight. Left versus right. So even though I said there's emphasis here because of the way the lines are put together, emphasis here because of the value, the visual weight in this case seems to be on the left side, which is here, simply because of the darkness of the image. Now you could again then start to say, well, okay, let's put some over here. So now I'm starting to balance the visual weight. You notice how I made this smaller one darker. When things are darker, they appear heavier, which is what's called visual weight. And in that case, something darker, even though it's smaller, can tend to balance out something that's lighter but larger. Plus the fact that it has a bunch of angular, small shapes all put together. You have this little bump here, this line going into here. Now you might say, well, yeah, this is pretty simple stuff and everything, but we will go over this more than once because, of course, I already talked about closure 5 or 6 times. Every time I turn this camera on, we're talking about it. And so, okay, so we talked about with no shade, we had a focal point here. When we shaded it for emphasis, okay, then we compared both ends and had a confusing focal point. Now we have visual weight issues that we're talking about, okay? But this was where we achieved closure on this piece. Now we're back to, we've talked about emphasis, focal point, and visual weight. So here we now finally get to cropping. Okay, so cropping, part of the image is outside of the picture plane. Well, if you took a picture with a camera, you could zoom into something, and then the image would be bigger than the field of vision or the picture plane. So if I was to take this and I'll just take off the end. Let's try that. And I'll touch this one back over here. Okay, now to make that clear, now I'm going to use my pink pearl eraser, the rubber eraser, because sometimes this one gets rid of pencil marks a little better. Oh, I don't have my plastic vinyl one with me. I was going to compare the two. That's all right. And you should continually be using these erasers like this, trying to figure out what eraser is going to work best for you. I'm telling you, it really makes a big difference. Okay. So cropping part of the image. So part of the image is outside of the picture plane. So that seems fairly simple. Now, let's say I have another drawing here. Now what I did here was I actually took, let me get this out of the way. I actually took this image, obviously, and cut it into 3 pieces. And so the reason I did that is I wanted to talk about, you know, if you take a complicated image and you start to divide it up and you start to look at it, you can see a little easier where why I was talking about focal point, for instance, which if you look at this, I said, well, I still think the focal point is here. Now, what you learn the more you do it is that you can start to divide these up. Now, if you look at the bottom part here, you say, well, yeah, maybe it has a kind of a point here, but it doesn't look real, it looks very similar here and here. They're kind of the same. And actually, if you were to turn them, it's a symmetrical image. If I leave it this way for a minute, and you look at this next one, you go, well, gee, that's kind of a symmetrical image also. But it technically is asymmetrical, which means this one has a point and this one has a little straight line on it. Boy, this guy's getting really picky. Well, we're just trying to dissect this because, you know, as you get more sophisticated at looking at things, you'll spot these things right away. Now look at how complicated this is. This has a lot of things going on in a very small area. And you can see if I cover this up how that's really not that complicated. This part's very unique and very complicated. When you look at how much complication is in one small area, that's what makes a focal point. And you start to look at these, and there's really not much you can do with these. I don't care what now. It'll say, well, maybe if we go way into there, it's still symmetrical. So you see, when you start to take something like this and you learn to look at it quickly, you can evaluate the shape of things more quickly, and you can understand where the more interesting parts of it are. And this is very important for you when doing contour drawing. And we'll talk about that in the next part of this lecture. Okay, now the next, we talked about cropping, emphasis, focal point, non-objective art. Non-objective art is art that is really not based on anything in the visual world. Let me move this out of the way here. And it's usually based on using the medium as the message or the medium as the focal point, and how you use the medium, or in how you use the abstract principles of design. In other words, if these are two good examples over here. And so I'm going to move this to the center. Now these, if you look at these, you go, well, I don't see anything there that looks realistic. I don't see anything there that looks like it came from something that was real. It just looks like a bunch of space shapes. You see some loops and some circular shapes and undulating forms and curving forms. And they make a pleasing design. And if it's drawn well, it actually looks pretty good, visually interesting. Okay, so these are nice compositions. These are student works. They're in your workbook. So this is an example of non-objective art. Okay, so now I want to talk about, well, we got repetition here. Repetition of forms. I'll talk about it a couple times here before the end of this lecture. For instance, this circular form here and here and here are repeated. There's 3 of them. One is gray, 2 of them are white. These looped forms here are repeated. They're repeated this way in a light form. They're repeated opposite back here in what's called a really good value reversal. Value reversal meaning this goes from dark to light, this goes from dark to light in the opposite direction. That's something you did in Project 1. This is an implied line here, which is also a value change. This one did not change, this one did. And that's how it creates a separation. We'll be doing a lot of this type of work in Project 2. But again, these undulating, curving forms are repetitive, and the circular forms or the loops are repetitive. And what that does is it makes a more visually organized and pleasing design instead of having something new every time you look at something. So let's look at this project here, which is in your book that you'll be doing today in class. And what I did was I well, I traced it over because what I wanted to show you was this is a complete symmetrical design. And what that means is what they call a mirror image of one side to the other. And there's no variation in it. Now, if you take this away, this is the same design as this, only this one has value applied to it. So you can see right away that if you change, you can change the symmetry of a symmetrical design just by placing value in it. Now, for instance, let's talk about this shape here. Now, first of all, the strongest shapes are the largest shapes, also the darkest shapes. So one of the ideas in this project that you're supposed to do is you're supposed to make these two balance, but not symmetrically. So since they're already symmetrically in a linear way, all you have to do is rearrange the values so that they're not the same, but it will balance. So for instance, this shape here, which is over here, I might decide to make this one a darker shape. So you'd start filling that one in. And so on. So you would do this. You're going to be doing this right after this lecture, and in this way you're going to get the idea of what's going to happen, but probably in a more complicated way in Project 2. But this is a really good way for you to test your balancing skills to see how you visually balance things. And the other thing about this, when you start this project in here today, is that you should put a border on here, simply because this one has a gray background, and you may not want the background gray, you may want it black, and you do have to have a limiting area of the picture plane. I think that's going to be it for this lecture. Yep, okay. So the next part of this lecture will be on Project 2, which starts down here, and so the next lecture will just cover all of this area through here.